Hello everyone. Ooh, too loud? No? Good? Hi, welcome back at the Innovation Café. We're very happy that we're live again. As you can see, I don't know if most of you are new here or whether it's all well known. Some of you I know, some of you are new. Innovation Café is an event where we always try to connect the tech design and knowledge community of Eindhoven, always with some content. Today provided by Ruud. We're very excited that we're going to be back with our live editions, and afterwards we're going to have drinks. It does look a little bit different as normally. Normally we go to the bar and have a drink, but unfortunately due to Corona we're not allowed to. So we will have our drinks here in this area as well. Please, we want to ask you, if you do want to have a drink or something, you can go to the bar, but please sit down again afterwards, otherwise we get in trouble and we don't want that. Also after the presentation, there's a possibility to ask some questions to Ruud. I will repeat those so that we have the live stream as well that can enjoy the question as well. And after the event, we also have a meetup table where you can join Ruud for dinner if you want, with the Innovation Café special, 17.50 for a meat or fish dish and 15 euros for a vegetarian dish, and the kitchen will be able to tell you all about like what is on the menu. So we hope you join and continue the conversation then. And for now, I want to give the word to Ruud. So,
thanks a lot, Margot. Thank you for being here. For me, this is also something special again. It's the first time in a long, long period that I haven't been in front of an audience actually giving a presentation. So for me, this is something special, something new. I've been looking at avatars of people online for too long, and it's really great that you're all here, such that I really have an audience and we can hopefully interact a bit, discuss, because the topic that I'm bringing to you today, the story that I'm going to share with you, is a story that has its, say, room for discussion. It is obviously a story of AI, artificial intelligence. And with that word, with artificial intelligence, comes controversy. What does it mean? What is artificial intelligence? What is it going to do for us? What is it going to do for humanity? What are the dangers? All of that is what is on the discussion table continuously when you talk about artificial intelligence, AI. Today, I'm going to paint a more pretty picture. So I'm going to share with you a story of AI, a little bit of the history of AI. Where does it come from? What was the first AI? What is it today? Is it what we think it is? And what impact can it have on us as society, as humanity? And specifically, how did we use it? My research group and the collaborators in the University of Trento in Italy, how did we use it in this COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing? Okay, Margot, next slide. So AI, what is it? Let's dig into it. Well, if you ask me, what is AI? It goes back to a statement by Alan Turing, long ago. So next slide. So what you see here is Alan Turing in already 1947, who said, what we want is a machine that can learn from experience. That to me is at the core of AI. So next slide. If I would then have to phrase that into something more tangible, perhaps, maybe it's also more fuzzy, but to me it's something to hold on to. It's the ability to efficiently learn some model of the world from experience. So what does that mean? Well, that means today I walked in here, I parked my bike, and I saw the door, the entrance to the Kazerne. And I saw it's a big, heavy, a metal door. Yeah, so probably I will have to push it a bit to open it. That's a model of the world. It's something you have in your brain. You see, you observe, you have a model, and you can infer things from that model. Yeah? So then you push it. You push the door, and the door moves. It moves along. And fortunately, I pushed hard enough, so the door opened. If you did not, then you might want to correct that model of the world. And that is what we're doing all the time. So we're forming models about our environment, and we're inferring something useful from that. So it's not just the ability to learn something from the world around us, but also to infer something useful from that model. Okay, next slide. So we do this very early on. Already 11-month-old infants, they already have some form of a model of the world. And there's been some very nice research at the Johns Hopkins University, where they did some studies with 11-month-old infants, and they did the following. The thing was as follows. They put these infants in an environment, a scene, in which their model of the world would actually break down. So what do I mean with that? Well, infants play with toys. And they know at some point what these toys do and what these toys can't do. So at some point what they do is they let these infants look at these toys from a distance, and then they let them levitate. Defy gravity. Yeah, that's what you see in the top left over here. It's a toy, but it's defying gravity. It's just floating around, levitating. And these kids, these infants, they would pick up their own toys, which they had in front of them, and they would pick them up and they would drop them, just to see if their model of gravity still holds. And they would repeatedly do this. Fine, yeah, my model of gravity is still okay, it still works. So these kids, they already have some notion of intuitive physics already after 11 months. Right? So that early on, we as humans already develop models of the world, and we do something with that. We do something useful with that. But it's not just kids. It's not just humans. Next slide. Also animals. Have a look at this image, this video. This orangutan is looking at this cherry, and the cherry goes into the cup. And of course, his model of the world tells him that the cherry should still be inside. But this trainer is a magician. And it's gone. So the model of the world of this orangutan breaks down at this moment, in a way very similar to the way these toys were defying gravity, and that did not fit into, did not connect well with the model that these infants had of the world. And here likewise for this monkey, the model of the world was such that this cherry, this fruit, should be still in the cup. It can't disappear, right? Conservation of mass. Right? It's a fundamental law of physics. Can't happen. So it started laughing. And that's typically something we do when our model of the world breaks down, right? When we visit a magic or something like that, we see something surprising, we sometimes laugh. And that's our model of the world breaking down. Okay, next slide. So what was the first actual learning machine? It was the perceptron in 1957. It was developed by Frank Rosenblatt, and it was called the perceptron. This perceptron was a very simple thing. And yet, next slide, I want to quote this newspaper. The Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer today that it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. Wow, that's a thing for this perceptron, and of course it could not do that. Right? And now we are in 2020. Next slide. And in 2020, we still can't really do that. But what can we do? Well, what is at the core of artificial intelligence today? You've all probably heard about it. It's something that comes by every once in a while in the news channels. It's called deep learning. It's called deep learning because this perceptron, this small thing, which was actually not so small, it was a whole bunch of electronics in a big room, but today it's a small thing in a computer, was expanded to something very big and deep, with many layers of such small perceptrons. So what was once a big pile of electronics is now squeezable in a little bit of software, and we can do a lot of those after each other. And as it turns out, the strength was in the extent. So it's sometimes surprising to see, and we'll come to that in a little bit, that if you increase the complexity of something, that it actually becomes easier to learn. But that's what it is. So dimensionality, the sheer size of these complex perceptrons, these multi-layer perceptrons, these large deep neural networks, The complexity allows them to learn. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so deep learning today is the driver of AI, computer vision, and natural language processing. It's what you see over here, right? It's cars that are recognizing other cars, that are recognizing pedestrians. That is what we know as AI today, and that's driven by deep learning. Next slide. But it's not new. Actually, most of the technology in deep neural networks, so the driver of today's AI, was already invented long ago. In fact, what you see here in this movie is Jan LeCun, who's today the director of AI research at Facebook. You see him behind his old PC. And convolutional neural networks, deep neural networks were already implemented over there. They're running live. So what made the big difference? What happened between 1993 and 2020 that today makes these deep neural networks, AI, flourish? Like not before. Huh? Next slide. It's this. Moving from 1957, the perceptron, to LeNet, Jan LeCun's deep network, to today, in 2020, we have an enormous increase in complexity, enormous increase in compute power. So moving from this perceptron, this big machine, big electronics in a big room, to 1993, Jan LeCun behind his computer was already increased like in compute of a factor million. Right? 1 million times more compute in a PC. Today, the most complex AI systems operate on 100 million times the complexity of that original perceptron. And that's the power. And that's why we can do amazing things today with artificial intelligence that we could not do before. Okay, so let's have a look at one of those brilliant breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. You see already a hint of that over here on the top right. It's Alphago. For those of you that don't know, Alphago is the first learning machine, the first AI that managed to play the game of Go at grandmaster level. Top level in the world. World-class level. And that's remarkable, because people thought that this was simply impossible for machines. So we're now going to have a look at a short movie. And yeah, that says it all, I would say. So next slide.
Go is the world's oldest continuously played board game. It is one of the simplest and also most abstract.
Beating a professional player at Go is a long-standing challenge of artificial intelligence.
Everything we've ever tried in AI just falls over when you try the game of Go.
The number of possible configurations of the board is more than the number of atoms in the universe.
Alphago found a way to learn how to play Go.
So far, Alphago has beaten every challenge we've given it.
But we won't know its true strength until we play somebody who is at the top of the world, like Lee Sedol.
A match like no other is about to get underway in South Korea.
Lee Sedol is to Go what Roger Federer is to tennis.
Just the very thought of a machine playing a human is inherently intriguing.
The place is a madhouse.
Welcome to the DeepMind Challenge.
The whole world is watching.
Can Lee Sedol find AlphaGo's weakness? Whoa. Is there, in fact, a weakness?
The game kind of turned on its axis.
Well, look at his face.
That is not a confident face.
It's developing into a very, very dangerous fight.
Ooh, hold the phone. Lee has left the room.
In the end, it is about pride.
I think something went wrong.
Yeah, it's made a mistake. He's got to pronounce a miracle.
These ideas that are driving AlphaGo are going to drive our future.
This is it, folks.
So how are we going to use this for humanity, right? So you hear it. These ideas that are behind AlphaGo, deep learning, AI, how are they going to help us as humanity? I'm going to share one example of that. So next slide. We're in this COVID-19 pandemic. What can AI do to assist those that are now in the hospital, that were overly burdened, the medical personnel. How can AI help them to make their life easier? So let's switch gears a little bit here. So now we're moving from what is AI, what is the history behind it, what have we been doing, where are we going, so how can we use it already today, and how we are using it in our lab at university. How are we using it today? Okay, let's move to the next slide. So it's all about this, a little bit of background. You all probably remember, it's not too long ago, the outbreak started in China. And of course, it started to grow very fast. We didn't see it coming, right? Well, the outbreak was going on like crazy in China. We were still celebrating Carnival here in Brabant. Yeah. So we obviously thought this was not going to hit us, or at least not to such an extent. Next slide. But that's, of course, not really the case. And actually, Brabant has been the hotspot of COVID-19 cases, and that's what you see here. So let's move towards a couple of images on this slide. So just click a couple of times. What you see, of course, in the news, the pictures that are far too familiar for all of you. You see patients being transported from Brabantse hospitals to Groningen because, there was simply no space anymore. And everybody was very concerned that this was what was going to happen. Are we approaching war triage? That means a patient enters the hospital and there's the decision made at that point, we're going to help you because you stand a good chance, but the person next to you does not stand a good chance. So unfortunately, we're not going to admit you to ICU. That is, of course, something you want to prevent at all costs. And many people have been working very hard to prevent that. Okay, next slide. So, what is important here? Triage. Triage is crucial. Who needs to go where? Which patient can stay at the ward? Which patient needs to go to the ICU? Which patient can go home, just in quarantine? If you are able to better assess which patient should go where, because you have insight in disease severity, that helps you a great deal in preventing all of this chaos. And you can do that. Because if you look at the statistics, a vast majority of the cases, corona cases, are actually very mild. Yeah? And only a very small percentage is critical. So only those people should actually go and be admitted to hospital. So this is important, but it's not trivial, of course. You can't judge by the face easily. Okay, this person is very severe, this person not. And what also doesn't help us is the swab test, right? The testing that is being done now. That helps us, of course, a lot in getting insight on the development of the virus in the population, but it doesn't help you very much with triage. Next slide. And that is because, this is the timeline. The timeline you see, so there are 2 points for triage. So after day 7, roughly, patients are either going to hospital or not. And then next, so that's a first question, should a person be admitted to hospital? And later on, when problems become worse, should a patient be admitted to the ICU, the intensive care unit? So those are just 2 moments for triage. Okay, so now let's get back to this swab test. Next slide. So this swab test doesn't give us any insight in disease severity. So it can't tell you, the lungs of this patient are in a bad shape. This is going bad. This patient needs crucial support. Or this patient is going to be fine. You can't see that from a swab test. Next slide. What do we have? Well, chest X-ray, Röntgen is something we can use, but it's not specific enough. So people usually, instead of X-ray, next slide, use CT, computed tomography. And CT is actually very powerful. So CT does reveal those changes in the lung that are associated to disease severity. So it does actually give a lot of insight for triage. But CT, of course, has downsides. Next slide. 3 main aspects. The first is, where do you do CT? you do CT in a specialized room, right? CT doesn't come to the ICU. It's a big device. It's a big device in a separate room. So what needs to happen is patients that are at the ICU would need a CT, or patients that are at the ER that should be getting a CT. They can't get that typically in the room. So those patients need to be moved. And these are patients that are critically ill. These are patients that are possibly contaminating other people. So you want to prevent moving people around. Yeah? So that's the first. There's significant risk of cross-contamination, and it's risky for the patient itself. CT, of course, also imposes ionizing radiation. This is dangerous radiation. Of course, today's CT systems, especially for this purpose, work in a low-dose regime, which means that they use very little of this ionizing radiation. But at a population level, you want to prevent using CT as much as possible. When you have an alternative, you want to do something else. And thirdly, limited availability. Right? So in the peak of the pandemic here, waiting time was up to 4 hours. And that, of course, leads to congestion in the acute care chain. You want to prevent these kind of long waiting times. Okay, so what is an alternative then? Next slide. Ultrasound. Echo. Ultrasound is very special. It's a very special imaging modality. Why? Because ultrasound, you see it already here, you can connect your ultrasound probe to your smartphone. You just attach it to your phone. You can bring it along with you anywhere, which means you can bring it to the patient. Yeah? You can go to the ICU and image over there. You can go to the ER and image over there. But what is the big disadvantage of ultrasound? If you're not trained to look at these images, you only see a big gray cloud. Yeah? If you're not trained to look at these images, it's just gray. Grayness. It's like grayscale television, but then even worse. Yeah? You don't see anything, so you need to be trained. And that is exactly where AI can help. Next slide. If you were to bring AI to the phone or to the device, then all of a sudden you can bring ultrasound to all those people that are not specialized at using ultrasound. Yeah? If you have an AI that is helping the clinician, that is helping the medical staff in making the judgment call based on the images, that is helping it to position the probe correctly, then all of a sudden it becomes accessible to many, many more people. Yeah? So that's kind of the dream. And that means that you can bring it beyond these expert centers where you have the specialists that know how to do it. Okay, next slide. So that would be something like this. Yeah? It would be bringing intelligence to the phone that would tell you at that point, okay, this lung is severely damaged. For instance, 40% of the surface is affected or something like that. That would be the dream then. Okay, next slide. So how do you teach it to do this? We didn't talk about this yet, right? How did this system, this Alphago, the system that beat this grandmaster at the game of Go, how does it learn? How do these deep learning systems learn? Well, like we do in a sense, by looking at a lot of examples, by looking at data. So they look at a lot of these images. So we took a lot of these images. These were collected in Italy at the peak of the pandemic over there, coordinated by a group in Trento, University of Trento. They collected a lot of these images. They sent them to us, and we started training the AI to recognize important characteristics of COVID-19 and lung disease in general on these images. Yeah? So looking at a lot of these examples allowed us to train this AI. Next slide. We went beyond that, so we didn't squeeze just one AI in. No, we said, okay, let's train a whole bunch of them. So we take, like in democracy, right? I'm not advocating here that democracy is the best way to govern or something like that. That's a whole other discussion. But at least you have a whole bunch of people voting, and you hope that at least the majority vote says something useful, and that all of the small deviations get kind of cancelled out. So that's what we did here as well. So we took a couple of these AIs, a couple of these learning machines. We all had them assess these images, these ultrasound images, and all formulate their opinion, and subsequently produce one outcome for the physician to look at. Okay, next slide. And that's what you see over here. So we made this grayscale television into, say, a color television. Yeah? So we have colors now. And these colors, they say something about severity. So blue is healthy. So this is just an overlay that is running like on top of this grayscale image, in which you don't really see much if you're not an expert. So on the top left is a healthy lung, and it colors blue. Good sign. And the bottom right is a very damaged lung. So score 3, and it's all red. And then you have in between two other scores, score 1 and score 2, which are different severity levels. And you see that it gradually moves from 0 to 3. And the nice thing about this is that this runs in real time. What does that mean? It means that the images come in, and they become processed, and you get in real time these kind of color enhancements of these images, which allow you to really quickly assess what is going on. Okay, next slide. So the ultimate dream, of course, of this is still in its infancy, in a sense. So we know how to do this, but it's not on the phone yet. We didn't really put all of that on this phone. So that's the next step. That's the first next step. Putting this intelligence really on a phone, allowing all of the people that are using these wearable ultrasound probes that you can connect to your phone, these point-of-care devices, allowing them to access this. Second, there's of course another problem with ultrasound, and that is that you actually also not only need to be an expert to interpret the images, but also to make the images. It's not just I put the probe on the chest and be done with it. No, it's actually much more complex. You also need to be trained to do that. So we also want to include this, like an AI that helps the medical personnel to do a better job at probe placement. You should turn a bit left, a bit right. Yeah, that's correct. That's how we should be doing it. And that way you not only create better images, but you also immediately train the personnel. Yeah? So that's another advantage. And a nice thing, if you make all of this digital and you put this intelligence in these systems, you can immediately make a report out of that. So you can keep track, suppose an ICU medical doctor is doing his round with the patients and scanning. He can see, or she can see, looking back 2 days, what the difference was. Are we progressing? Is this patient showing more blue? Or is it more red? Yeah. So those are the kind of things that lie, hopefully, in the near future. Next slide. But it's not just COVID. So the technology that we developed here is a technology that is very broad, right? So if you think about it, it's perception. It's perception on ultrasound images, and it has many more applications. If you just think of lung ultrasound, so that's relevant to COVID, even just in that scope, you can think of many other diseases that would benefit from this kind of fast assessment. But it goes much broader even than lung ultrasound, right? If you would put really true intelligence on all of these applications, all of these ultrasound applications, then ultrasound really becomes the imaging modality that can reach many, many people, because it's so cheap, it's so easy to bring to people, it's so portable, it's so widespread, and then it also becomes very easy. Yeah, so that's the dream. Okay, next slide is the final slide. Some acknowledgements. We didn't do this alone, of course. So, of course, the University of Trento in Italy, they provided us with the data and all the clinical insights, Dr. Demi and Ricci. Funding agencies, NWO, Nederlandse Wetenschapsorganisatie, Google, Kickstart AI, Philips, and the MTIC, the Eindhoven Innovation Center, and my group, the Biomedical Diagnostics Group, and of course, last but definitely not least, the students, because these are actually the people that work day and night to program these brains in computers and make them learn. They do the hard work, so big thanks to them. And that brings me to the end of this talk. Thanks for your attention. It was great to be in front of a real audience again. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruud. Yep. I will just repeat the questions just for our audiences online. So if you can, you had a question.
Yeah, so that's a very...
Sorry. You can also repeat them if you prefer. That might be easier.
Yeah, so yeah? I think so. Yeah.
Let's do that.
So the question was, how are you going to measure probe position? How are you going to guide a physician placing the probe? Because of course it's not trivial. You have to consider a couple of things. What does the physician use when they are placing the probe? Two things. One is their own eyes, looking at the patient, seeing, okay, I put my probe roughly somewhere here. But a very important aspect is actually not that. It's the image itself on the screen. They look at the image and they just know, I recognize this. If I turn a bit left, I'm in a better position. They just know. They've seen so many of these images that they just have to look at one example and sweep a bit and they know exactly where they are. It's really impressive. I've seen it a couple of times. To just stick it on, I'm still looking at this gray cloud, I have no idea. And they know, oh, like this I find the heart, or like this I find the lung. Yeah? So that leads me to believe that actually you do not need much more than the images itself to give this advice. Okay, this is a very interesting question. Let me repeat it. Is your AI able to explain why it's coming to a certain conclusion? This is maybe the biggest thing today in artificial intelligence. Why? Yeah? Why is the AI doing what it's doing? And it's immensely complex. And the reason is, I think, the following. A big reason is that today's AI, especially the one we used, is perception. It's just perception. It's not reasoning. It's perception. It's looking at things in the image, extracting features, and from a large amount of data correlating those features to some outcome. Yeah? Reasoning is a whole different game. It's looking at the images, seeing patterns, connecting common sense, you could say, to those patterns, and then based on those, come to a conclusion. Yeah, that's one of the big dreams, of course, in AI, to bring reasoning into AI, explicit reasoning. And my firm belief is that you need generative models for that. What does that mean? Like I was saying before when I entered here and I had to open the big metal door, you need models that explain the world. Why? Because if you have models that explain the world, you can reason about them. Yeah, you can say, okay, if I were to do this, what would happen to the world around me? And then you can start to reason. I kind of dodged your question, right? And you may have noticed, no, this AI does not reason. All it does, it simply says, score 0, 1, 2, 3. And what you can only do is validate it. So show in a large amount of patients that it actually is accurate.
Any more questions?
Yeah, another good question. The question was as follows. Ultrasound is a technology that is by far not standardized, if I may freely interpret, which means that every vendor, every manufacturer produces different kind of images, right? It's like comparing a Samsung television to a Philips television. One is ambilight, the other does not. More contrast, less contrast. So it's different. Yeah. How can we accommodate for that? So first, you also asked another question, which is, did you train on only one of those machines or a lot of them? We trained on a lot of them. So all these hospitals, they use different kind of scanners, and we just took all of them and we let the AI learn to find the commonalities among all of those different kind of images, and see what matters across vendors, so across systems, and not within. So that is one way to tackle that, right? One way to tackle that is to say, okay, let's just look at a whole bunch of those vendors, and then let the AI learn on that, and yeah, if it can learn based on that, then it can generalize to all these vendors. Yeah. Another way to approach this target is to say, this problem, is to say, okay, let's take the images from one vendor and let's just manipulate them in all sorts of ways, such that they look like the whole distribution. So this is always there's a key question underlying here, underlying this specific question, which is, how do we make sure that machines and intelligence of machines generalizes across the world, right? And generalization means I train on a specific distribution of data, yeah, and I'm going to move to a different scene, a different distribution of data, a whole other pile of data, and it also works there. That's a very interesting field of research. There's a lot of work being done in that direction, and yeah, it's just a very interesting piece of work. Yeah, there's a lot to be done in that direction. So domain adaptation, generalization, these things are yeah, very commonplace in AI research. Yeah, so did we use still images or movies? We use still images. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so what they did is they placed the probe and they would make a video, and then they would annotate some of the videos for us, right? So we have expert opinions on, okay, this region is healthy, this not, and then we would train our algorithm to reproduce that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. It depends. Let me repeat the question. So the question: how much data do you need? Right? How much from how many patients? What is enough? Well, this question is not so easy, and the question boils down to statistics. It's all about the data distribution. So there are two questions. One is, how efficient can an AI learn? So how many examples do you need to learn something that lies within a distribution? Suppose that you would have a robot or an AI that walks around in only this room. So that's a specific distribution of colors, specific distribution of objects. How many images does it need to take to say something useful about this entire room? That's like learning efficiency, right? And the second is, if I would place it in another room, how well would it do there, and how many rooms should I see? Yeah, so those are like different questions. And both are actually, one is more difficult to answer than the other. So the efficiency, so how much do you need to see of the same room? Not so much. Right? So there are a lot of tricks that we put into these algorithms to make them learn very fast. In particular, we exploit what we know already about the scene. For instance, we know that if I take an image of this room and I look in that direction, that roughly, if I move now the image over there, that this object is going to stay in that position and it's just going to slide back. What does that mean? I should process an object that is over there in a similar way as I should process an object that is standing over there. And we exploit these things. We use these things in the design of the networks, in particular by using convolutions. So as a technical thing here, it's very similar to our visual perceptive system. It's processing that does the same over there as there. So it's invariance to these kind of things. Yeah, that's... Yeah, so can you relate this to another application or another problem? Yeah, so you're saying breast cancer, it took us 15, 20 years to get there. Well, it depends a lot on how different the rooms are, to relate it back to that again. So it depends a lot on how different the phenotypes are. Right? The phenotype is how it appears on the image, how it manifests. Yeah? So it's a much more complicated question than it seems. How much data do you need? It depends on how complex the distribution is, and at this point, we don't know yet. Yeah? So it's so complex, so fast, it's so short, right? It's only a couple of months, right? So it's very hard to say something about that. What we can say is that, you know, within similar rooms, we do very well, really very well. But we don't know if we would go to something completely different that we haven't seen before. Yeah, then that depends a lot on how different that environment is. We're fairly confident. We've seen a lot of examples, and it works on all of those. But you have to realize these kind of things. You have to always be aware of the fact that learn to recognize this room, and maybe not the room next door.
We have a live question, a question from our live chat online. At the current rate of development of the project, in how much time could it be estimated of having a working system that can be used in a hospital setting, as shown with the phone and ultrasound probe?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. It depends on a lot of things. Number one, funding, money, of course. The way we did this project is, I worked with a couple of my PhD students, and I said, for a moment, pause your projects that you're doing now, and we're going to jump onto this. We're going to do this. We're going to do something to help. But yeah, they have to go back to their own projects because they're funded from some sources. So in the end, it's a money question. It's a question how much money you get, how many people you get, and that's what we're working on. So we're trying to get a lot of funding for this. We're working on getting people for this. And if we would have those resources, then it can be really, really fast. It's a matter of resources. Oh yeah, what do you do to get those resources? Well, you talk to the government. Right? The government, for instance, around COVID-19, they organized through all sorts of funding agencies, like ZonMW is such a funding agency, from NWO is a funding agency. They organize these calls. So it's a call for proposals then. And then you have to write a research proposal in which you say, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do. And then, they cherry pick, and they're like, okay, this gets money, this gets money, that gets money, and this is just outside. Yeah, that's how it works. So research is continuously a struggle for money. It's getting your projects funded, it's getting your work funded, and getting consistency in that. The nice thing is that AI gets a lot of momentum. So if you work on AI and do nice things with AI, usually getting funding is a little bit more easy. But that's what it boils down to. So that's the route you get money. Another route is via companies, of course. Here, a question in front. What is the current result of the research and what are next steps? Current results is what I shared with you. So current results is that we have this offline system which runs on a server where doctors can take their images, they can upload them to the server, it gets processed, and the AI is making its analysis, and that's it. That's the current state of the research. Next step is, one, getting into the phone, and then helping with the probe placement. So those are the next steps. Yeah, so during the corona pandemic, we did not use it yet in the Catharina Hospital. So it's very difficult to get things medically licensed. Yes, and that's for a good reason. You can't just put things near patients and medical practitioners. You can't do it. It has to be verified well. So you can't just do that ad hoc. Yeah? So that's a whole legislation process, and that's something we're going through now. Yeah, so, yeah. In the back, question? How often did the AI fail to recognize the damaged lung? In the examples that we have, a seriously injured lung was never missed.
I have a live question that might connect to that. They're asking if there are some assessments to the accuracy, like false positives and false negative rates. That's, I mean.
Yeah, so definitely we can say something about that. Well, I did have a slide in it, but I don't think we can pull that up. But okay, let me say something about that. There are two things here. One is, how accurate can you detect in every frame every pixel, right? So every dot in the image, how well can you say this should be blue or this should be red or orange? And if you would aggregate that to a video level, how good would you be able to say something about that video? So now we looked at the first, how well can you say about each pixel, whether it's blue or red or green or yellow, right? Those different orange, there's different colors. And that was at a pixel level, 93% accurate at a pixel level. Yeah. Question in the back. Yeah, so how do you see accountability for these systems? This is, of course, an ongoing debate. It's not a debate that is just about this. It's a debate that is going on for some while already between these legislation agencies and of course the researchers that want and medical staff that want to bring this to people. It's an ongoing discussion, but as it stands now, what you see is that there is some movement towards it should not per se be fully explainable if you can demonstrate on a large amount of examples that it works well. And of course, this is not very different from drugs, right? So lots of drugs are used because they work well in big studies, not because you can prove why they work. So I think we're going to move in that direction a bit. Yeah, that's a good question. How do you... Yeah, so this discussion is about, okay, how do we hold medical staff accountable? And of course, that happens indeed a lot. Yeah, so if mistakes are made, yeah, medical staff is held accountable. So that does happen. There are checks for this. There are a lot of regulations for this, and you have to. The important thing is that you have to keep track of what you've done, right? So being able to backlog whatever you've done is super important. So that's also for these systems. And there are a lot of things you can say about these algorithms, like why did it go wrong? Well, you can backtrack that a little bit if you have experience with these systems. You can dive into their brain a little bit and figure out why they are doing things the way they are doing. But yeah, it's a very good question. Who do you hold accountable? And it's an ongoing debate. But let's take it this way. Who do you hold accountable? It's maybe a similar question for maybe the non-AI image and signal processing that is in all these systems, right? So don't be surprised. I mean, the data that is on the image is not the data that is measured. It's not. It's very far from that, right? So there's a whole bunch of processing that is done in these systems to make it look like an image that you can at least judge to some extent. If you look at that raw data, it's impossible. You can't do that, right? It's gigabits of raw data that you have to look at for these ultrasound images. Gigabits, right? So you can't do that. So in any case, also there, who do you hold accountable if there's something in this chain that makes something disappear or appear? Yeah, it needs to be tested a lot. Yeah.
I think we have to go to our last question. So.
Yeah. So how do you make sure that you have learned sufficient to be able to deploy it in practice? Yeah, testing. So all you can do is test a lot of cases. Take data from different institutions. These are typically called multi-center trials, right? So there's a reason why people do this, multi-center trials, not just from one institution. Let's look at a lot of institutions, see what happens, and if it's good, if it's working there, then you're quite sure that it's doing well. But make no mistakes, it's very similar for drugs. There are also tests, clinical tests, and if it works across those clinical trials, then yeah, you put it out in the public. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Yes. Yeah. So the true dream is, of course, a learning system, right? Like a medical doctor that keeps on learning, getting new data. That's very challenging from a regulatory perspective. That's very challenging. Because then indeed the system is stochastic. It changes. And you can't control how it changes. Yeah. So that is definitely a no at the moment. Though it's super interesting, of course. Yeah. But should not, I mean, in my view, it should not prevent us doing a lot of research on that, because it's extremely interesting and there may be legislation for that at some point. And if accountability can be given through explainability and reasoning because you're progressing in AI, then at some point it may be possible. Yeah. And I'm actually pretty confident that that will be the case. I mean, there will be a point, I'm very sure of it, that we will have AI that is as intelligent as we are. At some point. And certifiable.
Great. Well, thank you, Ruud, for answering all of the questions in your presentation. For the people here, we actually are going to move to the bar in a second, and I'm very happy about it. I don't know about you, but it's very hot here. So it might be good to continue the discussion over there. Also for the people at home, thank you for watching, and we hope to see you next time during the live stream. You can keep an eye on the website to see when the next live stream will be. And also find more information about the next presentations. Also for the people here at home, we hope to see you again next week as well. And for now, I would like to really invite you to go to the bar and please take your glasses with you. And yeah, thanks.